Achtung, Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways 12 Days of Christmas Guests, where we're talking to a famous face about their personal relationship with the Second World War. And, of course, today, Happy New Year. It's the 1st of January 2023, can you believe it? Anyway, on today's episode, Al and I caught up with the brilliant Sebastian Faulks about his very personal interest in the Second World War and how it has inspired some of his amazing novels.
Achtung, Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, our Christmas editions. And who are we talking to, Jim?
Well, he's an old friend of mine and one of my absolute favourite novelists and the favourite novelist of many, many, many millions as well. It's Sebastian Faulks. He's also sometime batting partner of mine. Sebastian and I will be forever bonded by a very special day in Colombo in Sri Lanka, where we almost got to 100 opening run partnership against some pretty tidy bowling, it has to be said, on a test match ground. We didn't quite get the three figures, but we almost did. And it was a very memorable day, not least because it was also the day that David Bowie died, which is why I kind of sort of remember it. But another reason why I remember it. But we're not here to talk about cricket.
No.
We're obviously here to talk about the Second World War, but also Sebastian's books and of your many novels, Sebastian. You've written about the Second World War in a number of them. Charlotte Gray, obviously, Possible Life. And I've got to say, one of my absolute favourites of yours, Where My Heart Used to Beat, which was just a stunning book. Also partly set at Anzio, which I'm writing about at the moment. So it's kind of much on my mind.
Well, good morning, gentlemen. It's very nice to be here. And I have written a little bit about the war. I'm not an expert on it. I'm not a historian like you guys, but it's just something that was in the background of my life when I was growing up, I suppose. And my father had been an infantryman with the Duke of Wellington's regiment, as had the fathers of most of the kids I knew growing up, and our mothers as well. My mother was in the WAF. So it was just something that was there. It wasn't extraordinary. But when you're a child, of course, you know, all you're interested in is what's for tea and can I go and play football now and so on. And it wasn't until I was older and I suppose around about the age of 16 and I began to read books and think about life and history and who we were and what's going on that I realized the world we lived in was not quite as lovely and cozy and safe as mum and dad made out. That in fact, we were on the edge of a third world war. I remember very well the Cuban Missile Crisis and the long faces of the teachers at school. And I think at that point I decided to sort of try to understand how we'd got ourselves into this position. And of course, like most curious little boys, I asked Dad, and like most fathers, he was very reluctant to talk about it. Not because he'd been over-traumatized, but because that was then, and they wanted to put all that behind them and have a nice life now and live in peace and grow nice vegetables in the garden and play cricket at weekends and so on. But I suppose it was as a teenager that the sort of curiosity about the sort of bizarre nature of our life and our parents' lives first hit me.
But I think also the other thing I think about that generation when their children are asking them about it, they don't want their children to think of them as soldiers and ultimately people who have been trained to kill other people. I mean, this is sort of grotesque, isn't it? And I would imagine that most people just don't. You know, your father probably didn't want you to think of him in those terms. I think
that's right. I think I remember asking at lunch one day, "Did you actually kill any Germans, Dad?"
God, and what did he do? Clip you around the ear?
And he said, "Well." No, he didn't want to talk about it. I said, maybe, I probably threw a grenade, which who knows, it might have, blah, blah, blah. But I do know that after the first sort of serious action he saw in Tunisia, a very, very, unpleasant battle, which took place over a course of about 10 or 12 hours, after which he was awarded an MC, his first sort of big action of the war.
Wow.
He wrote in his own memoir, which is not for publication, but just for the family, that once it was over and it was clear that we had won, he knelt down behind a bush and wept just at the sort of release of the adrenaline. And because, he was a law student, he wasn't used to killing people.
Yeah, amazing. I've forgotten because we have actually, you and I have talked about Tunisia, haven't you? Because you were saying, I remember once you said, "Are you ever thinking of going to Tunisia again?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but if I do, I'll let you know." And
We were going to go actually, and then there was that terrorist thing, and we were advised that we couldn't go, and it's still not very good, is it? It's a great shame. I'd love to go.
I went there a couple of years ago.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, it was really all right, and you can definitely, I mean, your father was almost certainly been in the northern part of Tunisia.
He was, yeah,
and sort of Long Stop and Sidi Nazir and all those sort of places, and
he landed at a place called Beaune, the French name, which is now called its native name. I forget what it is now. The battle they fought was at a place called Banana Ridge, or that's what it was called by them anyway, because it was a sort of sandbank, I think, shaped a bit like a banana. But it was fierce. The Hermann Goering parachute troops were on the other side.
Yes. And in their first action.
So they did well.
Wow.
Goodness.
How amazing. Oh, I hadn't appreciated he'd written a memoir.
Well, it's not, as I say, for publication, but it's very factual. And it was quite useful for me when I was writing the book you mentioned before, Where My Heart Used to Beat, because my father wrote in a very, very practical and factual way. And so there was a lot of recording of the kit, what they were issued, what they carried, what they bought, what they left behind, what got nicked, what got lost. And all these little factual things which are quite useful to a novelist, because obviously you're going to be making up the story, making up the characters, making up their responses, and indeed what happens to all of them all the time. But these details are very, very useful to you. And you don't use them all. You just use 2 or 3 about particular greatcoat or knapsack or whatever it is. And that makes the reader, you hope, sort of believe in it.
Is that why you writing fiction about the Second World War rather than writing history, because you can say what they're thinking and feeling? Is that why you're not a historian? Because you're talking about it like a historian would. I need to know the details. I need to know what people are going through, the whys and the wherefores of what's happening. Why fiction?
Basically, because going back to sort of school days, I suppose what first turned me on when I was what I first began to do well at school was English and responding to English novels, poetry, and so on. And the combination of subjects I was studying at school actually precluded history. So I didn't really do any history at school, apart from, maybe 1 year on the French Revolution or something. And, I know historians and, it's really hard work. You're not allowed to make anything up at all. It's just all down the mines and, checking and then just incrementally adding a tiny bit to our knowledge of what happened or seeing it from a slightly different perspective. And it's very, very hard work. And I'm too idle and I'm too impatient, I suppose, is the answer. And because, people have been kind enough to respond to my understanding of character rather than of historical fact. So, I think I've made the right choice, Al, to be honest.
Well, I've got to say, I think you nailed the Anzio sequences. I thought they were incredibly affecting and moving. And having been there before, I thought it seemed pretty spot on, to be honest.
Well, it was. I mean, I did do quite a lot of reading, and I had been there myself.
It's horrible, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was
it's really one of the worst parts of that and the South Calabrian coast on the insole of the boot.
Yeah, it was very unpleasant.
Coastline. It's just really grim. It's just really not a nice part of Italy at all.
No, and this sort of malarial marsh which was drained, and then they let the mosquitoes come back. And I mean, basically, they were fighting in the beachhead in sort of little slit trenches, which were not at all deep, afforded very little cover, and as you know, were full of water and excrement and so on. And I know this is a rather sort of contentious area, but my father was, they were not, his regiment, his battalion were not particularly pleased with the American leadership. I know that, Mark Clark is considered a figure of some, there are 2 sides to every story, but they wanted to get moving, and they felt they were left sitting there in the beachhead waiting for the order for far too long. And my father was ordered back to base after he'd been occupying a forward position for a long time. And he sent the runner back and said, "I'm not moving." And the runner was then sent back and said, "If you don't come back and rest, you'll face the consequences." So very reluctantly, he went back to base. His company was then overrun, and they were either all killed or taken prisoner. And he felt, I think, for the rest of his life that had he stayed, he could have saved them. Meanwhile, it was
could have been killed.
Or he could have been killed. And meanwhile, while he was back at base, he was wounded in the head. And
Blimey.
I think he was actually talking to his commanding officer at the time. And they thought he died, and he was shipped out. He was taken to the hospital, the Beachhead Hospital, which the Germans then bombed. So while he was lying with his head wound, he then got some shrapnel in the shoulder, and he was taken over across the bay to Sorrento, and he was operated on. And his helmet had done a very good job in protecting his head, although I think his skull was fractured. But they thought he would die, but he didn't. He rallied, and he awoke and sat up in his bed to see Mount Vesuvius erupting across the bay, which was the last time Mount Vesuvius erupted.
Yeah,
my God.
In March 1944.
Yeah, his older brother, who was in Italy at the same time, was in Rome at the time and heard the news and hurried south. And when he arrived at the nursing home, he expected that my father was dead and that he would go to the funeral. But he saw this familiar figure standing on the landing halfway up the stairs with a bandage round his head, smoking a cigarette. And he thought he'd seen a ghost. And he was very moved by this, as you can imagine. Anyway, so Dad survived, and he was back. He rejoined his battalion and took the salute going into Rome from Mark Clark. We have a photograph somewhere. And then eventually he was asked to rest. He was sent to an infantry training school. I think it was probably quite a good thing, though. He was disappointed because he wanted to sort of push on north with the rest of them. But he had to go and do some, map reading and instruction and, whatever it is people do when they're not in the front line.
Well, the bloke in charge of Anzio was a chap called General Lucas, who was, and he'd been a kind of staff officer. He'd been a sort of staff officer general. He'd been like number 2 to, he'd basically been Patton's chum in Sicily when Patton was in charge of the 7th Army, and he'd basically been a kind of sort of observer, just to sort of get the lay of the land, kind of feel what it's all like, prepare himself for kind of higher command. Then he takes over 6th Corps, which is is an American corps to which British divisions were added, because Italy was unusual in that everything just mixed up because they were so short of troops. There was American 5th Army had lots of British divisions in it, even though it was American, had French divisions in it, even though it was American. And Lucas was then given command of Anzio, and he just didn't quite have enough to do the job. And the Allies by that point, very sensibly, had got to the point where, there's no point in taking massive risk because you've got such a material advantage, you're going to win anyway. It's sort of better to kind of hold out. But the problem with Italy all the way through was they never quite, the Allies by this stage of the war have a huge amount of material, and they've got plenty for the Pacific, and they've got plenty for Normandy, and, the build up of preparations for invading Normandy. But they haven't got much for Italy, which is a secondary theatre. They've got a lot, but they haven't got enough to do comfortably what they need to do. And Anzio is a classic case of that. They're trying to kind of unpick the deadlock which has arrived in southern Italy, where the Allies have come up against the kind of what's called the Gustav line. And they're thinking, well, how can we unlock this? Well, maybe we could do a flanking move around the back, getting behind the Germans. Wouldn't that be brilliant? And it would be brilliant, but they needed double the amount of troops and landing craft that they put into it. And it's shipping that's the problem always. And so Lucas, on one hand, was dealt a rather kind of bad hand. Because he was sort of damned if he did and damned if he didn't. It was a situation that he just simply couldn't come out of well. But on top of that, he also got browbeaten by the whole experience. And so he was relieved. And it was unquestionably the right decision to relieve him when he was relieved. But it still was quite tough shit on him, really.
Yeah. I wonder how much your average guy in the trench worrying about his men or worrying about his life. Very little in retrospect. But I know that my father was a huge admirer of Alexander.
Yes.
And he spoke his name with great reverence. It's all so bizarre talking about this, really. And I think, that's what fascinates me about the war and the war before. As you were saying earlier on, Jim, they didn't want you to think of them as people who killed other people. And why would you? And my grandfather, my mother's father, was at the Battle of the Somme.
Wow.
And he had joined the Artist Rifles. I never quite understand exactly what they are. He subsequently got switched to some sort of trench repair outfit, I think. But he was there in July 1916. But he sort of commuted back and forward from the front in some odd way. And he actually played rugby for England or an English side in 1917. So he was, 1 minute you're digging the bodies out of the trenches and you're under sort of heavy shelling. And the next minute he was rallying the Richmond rugby team and himself playing in, I think, an unauthorized international against Scotland. Who knows? It's so odd. I never met him, unfortunately. This is my maternal grandfather, because he was a very big, boozy, macho, second row forward rugby playing guy. He was a journalist, a sports journalist. During the Second World War, when he was working, he'd survived the First World War with some gas, but not badly wounded. The Daily Telegraph ran out of war correspondence in 1944-45. And he said, well, look, I'm still covering the golf and the, rugby football here in London. Why don't I go? So he went off with the Americans in his early 50s. And he was reporting the crossing of the Rhine. And he was shot through the head by a German sniper. And so having survived the trenches, the poor man was killed as a reporter in the Second World War. So I never met him.
Goodness me.
So, but,
wow.
I tell these stories about these people, but, this is what I'm fascinated by is not so much that my father or my grandfather were, extraordinary, but the fact is that they were so representative. Everyone's grandfather of my generation was in, on the Western Front. Well, not everyone, but most of them were. Most of the fathers of my contemporaries were infantry or RAF or Royal Navy or whatever. They just were. That was the fact of it. And it was the way that we had all normalized this and made it as if it hadn't happened somehow. It was so weird to me. And if you read the fiction that was being published when I was sort of a teenager, contemporary fiction by Iris Murdoch or Anthony Burgess or Kingsley Amis or so on, it was as if that war had never happened. It was never mentioned. None of the characters in these books ever seem to have been affected by it in any way at all. It's a great, great absence. And
isn't it? I've never thought of that. That's so interesting. You're so right. I wonder why that is. Is it just because at that point you just want to eradicate it? You just want to kind of wipe it?
I think partly you want to get on with your life, but also partly because it's such a disgusting subject to write about. It's so revolting, khaki and mud and blood. People don't want to read about that.
Well, yeah, and the war memoirs that you get in the 50s and 60s don't have khaki and mud and blood in them, really. They tend to be, it was a jolly good show, the chaps did awfully well. They tend to shy away from that's happening politically as well, isn't it? In the 60s particularly.
Yeah.
There's a proper effort to drop it and move away from it because it must be because it's too terrible.
I think so. It's a combination of terrible and boring, and the two things are not attractive to publishers or the reading public. But also, I think the films of the Second World War were an important way in which that war was remembered, perhaps falsely, as you say, Al. But films like The Cockleshell Heroes, The Great Escape, The Dam Busters, and so on, they were pretty entertaining films, actually, and at least they did record, 15 or 20 years later, something of what had happened, unlike the First World War, where almost nothing of what had happened was really accurately recorded. Well, the film industry was in its infancy, obviously, but the memoirs of the First World War came out, the famous ones we all know about, were all written by officers. They all came out about at least 10, 15 years after the war, and they were all very restrained, and there was a real absence, I think, of a sort of ground up account of what it felt like, either in fiction or in memoir, actually. Though, of course, there were massive amounts of documents, individual letters, postcards, diaries, which, of course, the soldiers weren't allowed to keep, but which they did and their families kept, and which then I found huge numbers of these, as many others have done, in the Imperial War Museum, which is a fantastic collection. And that's where I got the sense of what life was like for infantrymen in the First World War when I was writing Birdsong.
Yeah, of course.
Not from reading books, but from reading these documents and the details they gave about the rations, the tea, how long you were there. I mean, even you're sort of, going to lavatory or not.
Yeah, yeah.
And, all that kind of thing, which people, it helps you to bring alive the experience for people. And again, it's when you're writing about these things, it's partly saying, you're partly trying to escape from our desire to normalize everything. But on the other hand, you're also trying to make people see that it was normal. This was what befell you if by the accident of your birth. This is what your life would have been.
But also that these are people like you or I, you
Yeah.
know, with the same sort of thoughts and emotions and worries and anxieties and all the rest of it, but sort of magnified by the war.
And what were you thinking at 25 minutes past 7 on
Right.
July the 1st, 1916?
Yeah, yeah.
You probably, some of your thoughts would have been, some of them would have been rather operatic about the girl you loved and home, and you would have had noble thoughts, but you'd also have had some rather humorous or ignoble ones, like, where can I have a crap? Why does the tea taste so horrible? And these little realistic details, I think, help bring it home to people.
Yeah. It is interesting. We've talked a little bit over the last couple of years about how we remember the war. And it's very interesting. There was, I think it was a sort of report went out for it's the 20th anniversary of the Battle of Britain in 1960. And what are we going to do about it, if anything? And I think it was Tedder. He said, I don't think we should do anything. I mean, it's absolutely no interest to anybody anymore.
It's the
Macmillan
the Macmillan cabinet talk about it and say it's gone, it's over,
whatever.
Nothing to see here, which is incredible.
Harold Macmillan, who of course was wounded at the Battle of the Somme near Delville Wood, was shot in the knee, leading his men forward, managed to keep going, and eventually got hit again in the thigh and was bleeding very badly, and ended up in a shell hole where he managed to, sort of, with the help of one of his men, managed to put a tourniquet around his thigh. And he kept himself going alive by first having cat naps, but then secondly reading some ancient Greek text in Greek, which he happened to have about his person, and playing doggo whenever he heard German voices. And eventually 12 hours later, he was picked up, and, he could never walk properly again after that. So he knew what it was about. And then, of course, was played a very active role in the Second World War, but by this time as a politician.
I was on the government advisory committee for the commemoration of the First World War, which was a very large, unwieldy committee under the auspices of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And we sat for 6 years, I think, from 2013 to 2019. And one of the things we concluded at the end was that the planning for the remembrance of the Second World War needed to start now. So I think there will be, the centenary of the Second World War will be very widely thought about and so on, and how you do it is very difficult. We felt that the country as a whole did pretty well in the way that we thought about and remembered the First World War. It was very much a question of reaching out and getting a younger generation involved. And David Cameron's speech at the first event, which was the centenary of the Battle of Mons in 1914, was not very good, frankly. And it was very solemn and a lot of talk about sacrifice. But he clearly hadn't really done any homework. And he can speak very well, Cameron, if you think about the Bloody Sunday apology, for instance. And so we all thought we'll try and do better and try and make the speeches better and help the politicians, blah, blah, blah. And so I got very involved with the Somme centenary, which was fantastic, actually, though it unfortunately it fell about a week after Brexit. And President Hollande said he wasn't going to turn up, and two fingers to the British. And so it was very, very fraught. There was the Ministry of Defence, the Department of Culture, Media's Foreign Office. There were also, of course, all the local French authorities, right down to the parish council. So there was a strong sort of cloche-mail comedy aspect of it all. But in the end, Hollande did turn up. He read brilliantly. Cameron read very well, and I wrote a speech for Cameron to give. Though at the very last minute, it was reassigned to Prince William for some reason. So
how weird.
So even the palace was involved. But I don't know why I'm whittling on about all this. Just to show how jolly hard we tried to get it right, and that with the Second World War centenary will be better even than that, I hope.
How should we approach the centenary of the Second World War? Because after all, they're viewed differently in the public imagination,
aren't they? Yeah,
quite considerably so. You know, the Second World War at least has bad guys in it, and a just cause, I suppose.
Yeah. There are historians who view the whole of Europe's history as one long bloodletting.
Yeah.
And they very much dislike the First World War as being taken outside that long cyclical history of us murdering each other by the million all the time, always.
Yeah.
And had given a special poignancy, and they refer to this mockingly as the poet's view of the war. Mm. But I personally think that's wrong, because I think it was different for the very simple reason that it involved the common man, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, which hadn't previously been the case.
Yeah.
So it was the first to do that. No, the Second World War is how will people go about it? I suppose the most successful remembrance of it has been by the Jewish community worldwide, who made it their duty straight away to publish the figures, publish the facts, saturate the world with knowledge of what happened, to pursue the Nazis who were responsible, and so on.
Yes, but it wasn't until the Eichmann trial first that it kind of, because it was dealt with immediately afterwards, wasn't it? And then, because I remember my friend David Bernstein, his father Sidney Bernstein, he was head of Granada TV. He was given the job of recording Belsen. Mm. And so he got in there and was so horrified. He then turned it into some major film. Mm. And by October 1945, the Ministry of Information said, "We don't want you to finish that. Don't bother." Mm. So it was 95% complete, and there it stayed and remained until, I don't know, what am I thinking? Probably 2015, I should think, when the Imperial War Museum found all the they discovered that they still had all the reels and everything, and it was all completely finished, and it was paid to finish it off, and they produced this 80-minute film about it, which also included footage of other death camps and concentration camps being relieved. But it was swept under the carpet in 1945. I mean, completely. I mean, initially, let's go and shame the Germans. And then there was this complete sea change. And then until the Eichmann trial, it was very much under the radar, really, despite all the Nuremberg trials and the kind of, crimes against humanity coming into the parlance and everything.
Yeah, but that's not nothing.
Well, I know that's not nothing, but it wasn't to there were these bursts of commemorating the Holocaust. And then, of course, there was the Spielberg Schindler's List, which was the other big move forward.
Yeah. I mean, each country, my dad was actually in Palestine when the King David Hotel was blown up by Israeli terrorists. So, it was very, very complicated, and especially so in France. Which took, I think I'm right in saying 50 years to acknowledge its own part in deporting about 75,000 Jewish people, some of French nationality, some of other European nationalities, to Auschwitz. And they didn't want to know, they didn't want to tell anything about this, because there would have been a civil war in France, which was absolutely split down the middle, those who'd been with Vichy, those who'd been against it, with the Free French, as we know. And de Gaulle sold them the story that France had liberated itself by force of arms, and they had always hated the Nazis, they'd always resented the whole thing, which was obviously not at all the case. And it took them 50 years to put up a small, rather grudging memorial on the left bank of the Seine in Paris, commemorating some as a sort of bronze of a sort of refugee family huddled together with their suitcases about to be booted off to Poland.
Did you ever see that series, The Sorrow and the Pity?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that was made in something like 1969, and I think it was banned until 1984 or something like that, or 1990, or some incredible time later. When
I was writing Charlotte Gray in the middle 90s, there was not much in French to go on. I mean, the key book then was still, for the overall picture, was still Robert Paxton, an American, who'd written a book called Vichy France, published in the early 70s, and his bibliography, and he was a proper academic at, I think, Princeton, if I remember rightly, his bibliography is non-existent. He says there are no books. That was writing...
That's amazing.
That was writing 30 years afterwards.
Goodness.
I remember actually at Drancy, the camp in the outskirts of northern Paris, which was a half-built housing block, sort of low-rise municipal housing. They belatedly put a cattle truck and about 10 yards of rail in with a small thing saying, lest we forget. Again, that was done in the 90s, so nearly 50 years afterwards. And I remember standing there once trying to get a feeling of what this block had been like at the time. And a woman came up to me, a French woman in her 70s, and said, "What are you doing?" And I explained to her what I was doing. And she said, "Well, it's hardly changed at all. It still looks half finished. It was a half finished accommodation block when I was here." And I said, "Why were you here?" And she said, "Because I'm Jewish." And she rolled up her sleeve and she showed me the tattoo on her arm, her number.
Goodness me.
And I said, but, well, obviously she had survived. And she was 18 years old when she went. So she was old enough to work and young enough to be able to come back to that word we've used a bit, sort of normalize things. And she told me, and a lot of other people have told me, that actually 18 is quite a good age to be, because if you've come from a reasonably stable, ordinary background, you kind of trust that the world is going to be okay and that whatever happens is sort of all right, really. And you can keep on normalizing what happens to you. Whereas if you're young, you're not strong enough. If you're 35, you know that this is completely wrong and it's utterly traumatic, and you sort of give up or else go mad or whatever. But I think she was there for about 18 months, she said, Auschwitz, and came out very, in a bad way, obviously, but had put it behind her.
Survived.
Yeah.
God.
I mean, did that must have had quite an effect on you, didn't it? I mean, I think it would have had quite an effect on me, meeting someone like that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a terrible thing is that as a novelist, you're always looking for the telling detail, and
Yes.
but you're also looking for to feel authentic in some way. And what right have I got to describe what happened to small children, as I do in Charlotte Gray, who arrive in Auschwitz and they're processed on the ramp and they go left or right. Well, these little boys, obviously, I'm afraid, go the wrong way. What right have I wasn't there. I'm not Jewish. I was not one of don't belong to any of the groups that were murdered in this way. And you want not only to have the detail of the cherry tree outside the block where the showers were, but you also want to feel that you've been allowed to do it almost by physically touching someone who was there. And so you don't feel inauthentic or presumptuous. And a similar thing with Birdsong. When I first went to the Western Front in the late 80s or early 90s, I forget, with men who'd been there. And, we stood where they had stood, and one of them held my hand and talked me through exactly what the day had been like. So this is a sort of process of trying to make yourself feel less of an imposter and actually entitled to try to understand and do what you're doing.
Do you think you'll ever return to the Second World War in fiction?
Well, I am contracted to write another novel in the so-called Austrian trilogy, which began with Human Traces and then Snow Country. And so I've gone from about 1890 through to about 1934, and Hitler has been mentioned once, but I don't really want to write a story with Nazis and with the sort of full action of the Second World War, because I feel that others better equipped than I've done that. But there's something about sort of rebuilding Eastern Europe after the Second World War, which I think is pretty interesting.
I agree with that.
And there's a fascinating place in West Berlin. I can't remember its name now. It's that mountain built with rubble from the bombed remains. On which they then put the CIA listening station. And there's some terrible.
I filmed there.
Have you? It's an amazing place, isn't it? But it's like it's so clunky a symbol of human idiocy that you take the rubble of one war, build a mountain, and put a listening station on so you can intercept the Russians, who after all, won the war for them only about 10 minutes before. It's absolutely, but I mean, it's so clunky as a symbol that I'm wondering if it isn't too clunky. But anyway,
there's also the Humboldt Flak Tower, which is part buried by rubble, and part not, because what they did was, I think it was in the, if I remember rightly, this one was in the French sector. I may be wrong about that, but anyway, they blew it up, and it's just so thick, this concrete, that even with kind of vast amounts of explosives, they couldn't really blow it up. They could sort of it sort of slightly tilted, and bits of it slightly collapsed in on itself, but you can still get inside it, and you've got sort of raw bars and bits of flaking concrete and so on, and it all looks incredibly precarious, and there's no way the British Health and Safety Executive would let you anywhere near it, but in Germany you can get inside it, and it emerges, so there's a sort of quarter of it that sort of sticks out, and the rest of it is now a rubble hill with grass on it and trees and all the rest of it, and the whole thing is just so weird and bizarre, because it's like a lot of the, I mean, it's like going to the Berghof, for example, Hitler's house.
Yeah.
They've destroyed it, but you can still go there and pick up bricks and bits of the camo net that was over it in 1945, and you can still find bits of concrete, and there's lots of relics of it, and the retaining wall and all this sort of stuff. So they've got rid of it, but they haven't really got rid of it. It's the same with the flak towers. I mean, why would you leave it like that?
You can't go to his bunker in Berlin, can you?
No, it's concreted in.
You can
go to where it is. There's a sort of dog shit car park there.
Yeah.
But again, some of the symbolism is almost sort of, the Berghof, that's almost a description of Germany and its trace memory of the war, isn't it? That you can still pick up bricks that, and the rubble and the concrete.
I've got one literally just behind me.
Because they've been through so many phases of trying to accommodate, immediate denial afterwards, or the sort of year zero thing afterwards. Then two Germanys, because it's one of the things we've spoken to a lot of Germans about, depending on which side of the wall they're from, what their attitude to the Second World War was. Because we spoke to a historian in Dresden, who grew up in communist Eastern Germany, and his father had lots of books, loads and loads of Second World War fiction about the heroic antics of the Red Army.
Yeah,
what fantastic people they were. And he grew up on that tradition. They'd been liberated from fascism by communists, you know.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the wall falls, and he had to sort of start again in his mindset.
Yeah, so
how he
it's
thought about the Second World War. It's amazing.
So, Al, you're asking me how we should remember, or will we remember the Second World War? It's going to be a very complicated business, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Why don't we begin by asking people in the Baltic states how they remember it?
Or in Kaliningrad.
Yeah, but I think we will tell our own story. And actually, I think that's fine, because it is so fragmented, because everyone's story is so entirely different. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't retell our own story, which is very particular and something that we do feel proud of, and in my view, correctly so.
Yeah. Well, amen to that. I certainly agree with that. Well, Sebastian, thank you. That's been
thank you so much.
That's a really. It's exactly what I knew it would be, which was just a really interesting, wide-ranging, and varied chat. So good.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. But do spike it if you want to.
You would never spike it.
There's no spiking going to happen. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We've been talking to Sebastian. We'll see you all soon. Have a very Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
Bye.